of the Embassy of Poland, the Institute of International Business and Economics of Poznań University, and the Institute for Economic Research of the National Autonomous University of Mexico. This time, we are very proud of having Maciej Ziętara, Ambassador of the Republic of Poland in Mexico, Ewa Mińska, Director of the Institute of International Business and Economics, and Ken Oyama, the Secretary of Development of our university. I'd like to ask Maciej Ziętara, Ambassador of the Republic of Poland, to give a few words.
Thank you so much, Armando. Good morning, Mexico. Good afternoon, Berlin and Poznań. I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Ewa Mińska-Struzik, the Director of the Institute of International Business and Economics, Professor Ken Oyama, Secretary of Institutional Development of the UNAM, and I'd like to thank especially the persons who actually created this seminar. Professor Isalia Nava, Secretary of the Academic Secretary of the Institute of Economic Investigations, and Professor Ida Muskowska, the Program Director of International Economics. Also my colleague Michał Faryś from the Polish Embassy. And obviously, I would like to thank the scholars, the panelists of today's meeting, my dear friend, Professor Erick Behar-Villegas. How are you doing in Berlin? Isn't it too cold for a Colombian scholar?
It's very cold for a Colombian scholar. Yes, it is. I'm doing well. Great to see you.
Professor Piotr Trąpczyński from Poznań University of Business and Economics, and Professor David Bonilla from the National Autonomous University. Just a few words. I'd like to hear your opinions about the possibility of the opportunity, especially for Latin American governments, to a more robust support to the medium and small enterprises, medium and small companies, which are the core of the economy, and boldest counter-cyclical policies. How that would affect the deficit and the debt. As far as I could observe the situation in Mexico, the strategy adopted by the government is quite different from the European, and obviously it has to do with the fiscal space, but also with maybe some ideological convictions of some politicians in Latin America. So I wish you a very fruitful discussion, and thanks a lot to all of you.
Thank you very much. I'd like to ask Ewa Mińska to give a few words to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Armando. Good evening for those who are in Europe, and good morning for those from the other side of the ocean. It is a great honor and a great pleasure for me to welcome you all at the second pandemic webinar. This is a proof how pandemic translates into something good, into closer relationships and cooperation between three institutions. And let me take this opportunity to thank Professor Ida Muskowska, who is the main organizer of the webinar from our side, from the side of the Institute of International Business and Economics at the Poznań University of Economics and Business. I do regret I couldn't join the first webinar, so now I can't wait to listen to to today's discussion. So without further ado, I'm wishing you all fruitful discussion and exchange of thoughts and ideas. Thank you.
Thank you, Iwa. Now, I would like to ask Dr. Ken Oyama to give a few words to us. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. I am Ken Oyama. I'm in charge of the Secretariat of the Institutional Development of UNAM, Mexico. So good morning and good evening, everyone. Very nice to meet you, all of you. So thank you very much for joining us today for this seminar, National Reactions to the Pandemic and Implications for Countries. I send you my best wishes to all of you, and I hope you're in a good health in the company of your beloved ones. I send my regards to the Ambassador, to Your Excellency, the Ambassador of the Republic of Poland in Mexico, Maciej Ziętara. Very nice to meet you, Ambassador. And of course to Ewa Mińska. Nice to meet you, Ewa. It's a great pleasure to share this meeting today. And also Armando, thank you very much for organizing this meeting and also for inviting me to participate in this inauguration. I also send my greetings to all the speakers, the Professor Piotr Trąpczyński and David Bonilla, as well as the moderator in Professor Erick Behar-Villegas. I would like to say that to the Professor Behar, that UNAM has 14 units all over the world, and one of them is in Berlin. So if you have the opportunity to visit our offices, I mean, when the conditions permit us, you're welcome to visit our office there. It's Alejandro Velázquez, our director there in Berlin. So also I would like to say that we're very pleased that Poznań University and UNAM have organized this event, because we have a long history of collaboration between universities and academic institutions of the Republic of Poland and UNAM. Just an example, last year, in 2020, we published more than 200 papers in different areas. Most of them with the scientists in physics, physics, biology, molecular biology, and so on. So it's very nice that today we have a joint seminar talking about economics. So we're very grateful to join this seminar today, and particularly with Poznań University. We hope that we have the opportunity to have a joint collaboration projects in the future, in the very near future, because we have noticed that the collaboration between these two institutions is very important. So thank you very much for this opportunity. Thank you very much, Armando, and welcome all of you for this seminar. And we're very pleased to have this seminar today on the impacts of the pandemics on the economy and competitiveness and economy recovery. And as the ambassador said, the situation is completely different. In Mexico, we have a health crisis, but also economic crisis and many other crises. So it's very nice to hear the opinion of the experts on how they suggest to solve the different problems in Mexico or Latin America in general, and compared to what's going on in Europe. So thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you, Ken. I would like to mention that this seminar is possible because of all the organizing team and Dr. Isabel Nava, that was in charge of organizing the seminar in hand with Michal Fairis from Poland, from the Embassy of Poland, and we thank you too much. Now, I would like to ask to open the event by introducing to our moderator today. His name is Professor Dr. Erick Behar-Villegas, economist. He is currently the Dean of the Faculty of Business Administration of Berlin International University of Applied Sciences, with an international background that unites Colombia, Germany, and Spain. He earned his PhD at the Ludwig Maximilian University Munich in the area of applied cyber anthropology, studying narratives of attraction and their implications. He was worked as entrepreneur, manager, and public official, having held the position of Undersecretary of Economic Development of Bogota. He was appointed Dean of Economic and Business at the Universidad Central of Colombia. His teaching and research interests cover public spending efficiency, narratives, behavioral economics, and financialization. He has been active as lecturer in institutions such as Tecnológico de Monterrey, CESA, Business School, and Externado University. He is a member of the International Association of Hyper-Polyglots. Mr. Behar-Villegas writes about idiosyncrasy, economics, and Latin American legalisms for Revista Dinero, and recently finished the novel Laws in Legalandia. Thank you for helping us with this seminar. Dr. Erick, go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Armando, for this very, very special occasion, and a word of thanks also to the ambassador and to all of you who are here. And so I would start right away, if everybody agrees. Okay, fantastic. So as I was saying, I'm very pleased to be with all of you, greeting you from Berlin. As the ambassador was saying, it's very cold, but we have a very interesting thing in front of us, because we are to discuss something that we are living and undergoing. And for this matter, I am pleased to moderate this panel discussion today that unites on the work of Professor Piotr Trąpczyński and Professor David Bonilla from Poznań University of Economics and Business and from UNAM. So I will jump directly to introducing both of the professors, and then we're going to continue with their presentations and with a round of questions. Now, something concerning the organization of the panel, if you have any questions, you can write them down, and we're going to read all the questions after our panelists have already finished their presentation. So I'm going to start with Professor Piotr Trąpczyński. It's very nice to have you here, and I'm going to read, of course, I'm going to introduce your profile. So Professor Piotr Trąpczyński, our panelist number one, is Associate Professor at the Department of International Competitiveness of the Poznań University of Economics and Business. His research interests revolve around internationalization of firms and its implications for firm competitiveness. He actively supports businesses in their international expansion through consulting projects at the Knowledge Transfer Company of the Poznań University of Economics and Business. He has published his research, among others, in the Journal of World Business, Journal of Business Research, International Business Review of European, and the European Management Journal. He has also served on the board of the CE chapter of the Academy of International Business. So we're very happy to have you here, Piotr, and we are very much looking forward to all of this expertise that you bring, and to let us know also from the side of Poland what is happening to businesses and what situation, and in general, what insights we can draw so we can understand the reality and also the implications for the European economy and in general, the response and what it implies. So I would give the floor now to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Erick. Excellency, professors, dear guests, organizers, I'm privileged to be here, and I'll just share with you, I'll start sharing my presentation. Okay, can you see the title slide now?
Yes, perfect. Well.
Okay, great. So, so again, thank you very much for being part of this event. It's indeed very important to discuss the repercussions of the crisis, which is unprecedented and has many dimensions. This has been mentioned already, from the health-related one or medical one to obviously the economic one, and of course many governments, scientists, practitioners, and basically everyone is trying to figure out different solutions to the unprecedented challenge that we're facing. So it's important to try to learn from the evidence that we have at hand. Just an introductory note that I like to make is that I will refer to the overall, well, economy level, but my presentation and the points that I would like to share with you and incite some discussion are rooted more at the micro level. So I would like to go deeper into the perspective of companies based on the Polish example and recurring to quite fresh data that has been gathered only two months ago, actually, that this information was gathered from quite a large sample of Polish companies. I've been asked to talk about the implications of the pandemic crisis for competitiveness because I represent the Department of Competitiveness, but also I'm working together within the Microeconomics of Competitiveness program of the Harvard Business School, of which our university is member and part, and we work together. We cooperate in terms of teaching and research exchange with the Institute for Strategy and Competitiveness of Michael Porter. So I will refer to the understanding of competitiveness from the Harvard Business School as well, because I think it can bring our discussion to a direction which can hopefully yield some interesting insights as well. So, okay. Well, so needless to say that we're facing an unprecedented crisis whose scale is necessarily compared to some previous crises like the financial and economic crisis of 2007 and 2009. However, this crisis has, let's say, far more far-reaching mechanisms because it reaches both the demand and the supply side, which makes it special and especially challenging. So obviously, it is a medical and health calamity, but on the other hand, there are immediate and unavoidable economic repercussions of the measures taken. So in the second quarter of 2020 alone, the GDP fell by 40% in Europe. Of course, to recover in the next quarter, but that illustrates the first immediate shock, and this shock was deeper in the advanced part of Europe because of the scale of the first medical or health impact there, and also paradoxically the interconnectedness of these economies that is acts also as a transmission of medical but also economic shocks. So in the context of the the situation that we're facing, questions that I would like to answer with the presentation are in what ways the pandemic crisis affects companies of different sizes, and what these impacts depend on. So what differentiates the way how companies perceive different symptoms of the pandemic crisis. And on the other hand, how do the companies go about tackling the crisis, and what differs them or differentiates them again? So what makes them follow different, let's say, trajectories or strategies of reactions to the crisis? So, as mentioned, coming to the notion of competitiveness itself, before actually recurring to the data and discussing that. Competitiveness has often been discussed as the ability of countries to, for instance, to attract investors, to by let's say adjusting some parameters like labor costs, or by following some currency policies, but taking a bit broader look, which comes from this Harvard School of Competitiveness, is that we have to take a look at the macro and micro level at the same time. So companies. So the macro competitiveness is given if a country or a region is able to create companies that are able to compete successfully at the national and international level. At the same time, the country being able to generate decent salaries and life standards for the citizens. By talking about the competitiveness of the companies, so what it means to compete successfully, it's not just about survival, but it's about innovating, competing not just with costs, but with creating new products, new product categories, and being able to do so not just in the home market. So competitiveness in this meaning, the macro and micro levels are intertwined, and long-term competitiveness of a country is about creating the right environment for doing business for companies, so that they are able to thrive, also in different conditions, in different external conditions, more or less favorable. So, of course, the role of the country is, in that context, to recur to appropriate monetary policies, fiscal policies, public investment in order to shape this environment, make it competitive and friendly for the companies. But it's more than that. It's also about stimulating the cooperation between businesses, for instance, through cluster policies and regional policies related to entrepreneurship and to boosting the innovativeness of companies. So if we talk about just briefly about the mentioned macro level policies that say shape the business environment, then according to the International Monetary Fund, we're talking now about Europe, then the policy response, so the fiscal policy, the spending, and the revenue instruments to businesses are estimated by the IMF to have alleviated the shock in the scale of 2020 by about 5%. So if we try to quantify the scale of the support, to what extent these instruments or intervention actually took effect on let's say alleviating the overall significant negative impact on the economy measured by the GDP, which we can say is the ultimate KPI, because obviously there are different economic indicators in which the macro level we can see the effect of the crisis, others being debt levels, and obviously but the GDP we could say is the moment of truth, or the, let's say, the ultimate indicator of a country's performance, simplistically speaking. So it's important to consider this. And clearly there has been an effect alleviated, as mentioned, by the policies. So these policies obviously have been different in different countries, which also explains the different levels of effectiveness of the countries. So as can be seen also based on the IMF data, the spending basically has been higher as percentage of GDP in advanced countries, which have been more able to afford it. And obviously we talk about the percentage, but also in absolute terms, this help has been higher because of the, let's say, higher GDP in absolute terms. In countries like Poland, we could say relatively proportionately to the GDP, this level has been high. But also the question is not just what is the scale of the support, but also the structure or the qualitative aspect of the support measures in the economy to specific sectors and companies. How is it distributed? How is it conditioned? And this is something that we'll come back to in a couple of minutes, and in the discussion part of this panel. So if we talk, coming back to this understanding of competitiveness, that a country is competitive if its companies and businesses are able to compete successfully, then one of the indicators of competitiveness can be the international activity. And basically, the two basic forms of activity is international trade, so export-import data. And the other one is international investment flows, so foreign direct investment, basically. So if we take a look at foreign direct investment inflows into region, you can see a massive decline. It's just data that was available for the 6-month period of 2020, but already shows massive decline. Interestingly, maybe not so surprisingly, this impact being lower in developing countries. So if you take a look, for instance, at Latin America and the Caribbean, it's 25% decline compared to previous year, as opposed to a massive decline in Europe, showing interesting difference and resilience of the catching up economies in this respect. So this shows, this reflects the scale of the restrictions, and also the conservatism and careful approach also on the part of decision makers in companies making investments and withholding some projects for obvious reasons, because of the uncertainty and the distorted planning that made it impossible to make some to validate some big investment projects worldwide. So now going gradually towards the company level. So now talking about the competitiveness at the micro level, but as mentioned from the point of view of, for instance, the Harvard Business School approach to competitiveness, macro and micro are linked again. But now talking just about the micro competitiveness, of course, we have to see that companies, let's say, entering the crisis, started with a certain number of resources that they have, and they differ in that they have different endowments in intangible assets, such as brands, marketing, managerial capabilities, and also tangible resources, let's say tangible assets. And this is also a dimension that is affected significantly by the crisis, by every economic crisis, basically. Then another dimension of competitiveness is the competitive strategy. So basically how the companies are competing against the other companies in the market, for instance, with lower costs, or maybe with more innovative products, with something that many catching up economies are advised to do to avoid the middle income trap. So shy away from from competing just with labor costs, because it's something that that is elusive in the long term and fades away, as the example of China and Southeast Asian economies is showing. And then at the end, there's something like that has been discussed in literature is competitive position. So basically the performance. So how do our activities translate into financial and non-financial results, such as market share, such as profitability, and so on. So basically all these dimensions are interconnected, and they are all affected by the crisis, and all of them are to a different extent can be manipulated by the companies, by their decisions, and through external support as well, such as like in extending the resources of the companies that are in need, whose resources have been particularly eroded by the crisis, which led them to deteriorate their competitive position in the end through the crisis. Okay, so if we talk about the just taking a final outlook before showing data for Poland, in different European countries based on McKinsey and recent McKinsey surveys, it's known probably in many regions or continents, most sectors which have been mostly hit are accommodation, food services, agriculture, recreation, entertainment. So all those basically all those sectors which have been which have involved significant human interactions, and the related ones have been hit the most. And it is in these sectors that, according to surveys, the most companies, particularly SMEs, expected bankruptcies in the coming 6 months, so in the period that is still running, because the data is from August 2020. And the same for postponing growth projects. So companies were actually had to revise their strategy and abandon their ambitious plans. In a similar image is shown. So countries particularly hit, being Spain, United Kingdom, France, Italy. So countries where also the impact of the medical impact has been particularly severe. And again, services, accommodation, food, retail, and so on have been hit particularly badly. Okay, so I'd like to, because of time management, I'd like to move on to the survey. Just very briefly, it's a survey of 500 Polish exporters, that the findings of which I would like to share with you now. From manufacturing sector, but for you to understand like the nature of the data, so there are limitations, but basically like what we're talking about is it's companies that are exporting. So because the data come from a project that is devoted to exporters and their competitiveness. So the companies whose results you will see now, they have at least 2 export markets, at least 10% of revenues that they make from export versus 90% from Poland. So that's the minimum. And they are Polish companies, so making business decisions. So they are not subsidiaries, let's say, for example, of foreign multinationals in Poland, but autonomous companies. So all the questions that were asked about the pandemic period from March to October, because the study was in November, and the companies were asked to compare the same period, 2019, to the pandemic period. Okay, so talking firstly about the symptoms. So if you take a look at the 3 groups, the blue ones, the small companies, orange is medium companies, and gray is large companies. So if you take this, let's say, cross-sectional analysis or subgroup analysis for different symptoms, then you can see that for most of the dimensions, there is a pattern or dependency that the smallest companies were the most strongly affected, because the scale basically 7 means high level of effectiveness, and 1 means not affected. So basically, firm size does matter. So small companies have been affected the most, with the exception for the possibility to meet clients. So that turned out to be relevant for largest companies, which rely on meetings both with clients, with suppliers, trade partners, and so on. So the lack of ability of meeting them, interacting with them, was seen as a problem. But other than that, for the classical symptoms of crisis, which have also been discussed in studies on other crises like the financial crisis and so on, then such problems as delayed payments, as the fears of employees, as the decline of demand, they have been the most acute for the smallest companies, and then fading away as you increase the size of the company, with the exception of the demand increase. So those companies who saw the biggest, the most frequent increase in demand, actually, so treating crisis as an opportunity, were the larger companies, so the medium and the largest company. So that we can see in a, let's say, reverse trend. Talking about further symptoms, because there are more of them, then the same trend continues. So particularly steep difference for access to finance during the COVID crisis was among the smallest companies, the biggest problem. Difficulties in transport, costs of adjustment to the sanitary or hygiene regulations, distorted sales, production planning, or the excessive increase of inventory. So one of the most, let's say, acute problems of companies. So again, firm size seems to have great importance here. So now if we take into account not just the size, but if we take into account the export level, so how much revenue you make from exports, then you can basically see a similar pattern in that the most internationalized companies, so that those who export to not just to 19% of the revenue, but 20, 30%, the orange one, or above 30%, which is the biggest, they felt the least affected by the crisis in these symptoms. And this is a trend for all of the symptoms. So continuing here with the other factors, you can see the same tendency. Now, measuring internationalization not by export share, but by the number of the markets that you share. So let's say the diversification of your basket or portfolio of international markets, then you have basically a similar pattern. It's not as clear, but it also continues. The more foreign markets you have, the less affected you declare yourself in terms of the symptoms of the crisis, right? So it continues. If you take a look at other factors like the access to finance, particularly, or the management of unused production capacity. So clearly, if you do business, if you export your products to different markets, your effectiveness by the crisis is declining. You have more, let's say, arbitrage possibilities. You have more sources of demand and supply, and that works as a kind of buffer to the current economic crisis due to COVID. Okay, so now before moving to reactions quickly, the last breakdown for symptoms is industries. So if you take a look at low-tech industries, mid-tech industries, and high-tech industries by the conventional divisions of these sectors, then basically the trend is less clear. Okay, so you might expect that companies in the high-tech sector would be the least affected, which basically for many dimensions they are, but it's just by a narrow by a narrow margin. So regarding this breakdown, there was no such clear let's say pattern or dependency that was visible. So, for instance, for access to finance, it's not necessarily the advancement of the product that drives your ability to cope with some of the problems, such as financing. But I can see that the differences, as opposed to the internationalization factors, are much less pronounced here. Okay, so now briefly about the reactions to crisis. And this, for the purpose of the presentation, they are divided into two categories, which are called proactive and reactive. So basically, proactive meant that some dimensions asked they were increased as opposed to 2019. So during the pandemic crisis, companies increased some resources, capabilities, investments. And the reactive measures, or let's say the typical ones discussed in company studies or surveys regarding crisis, they are, sorry, someone is waiting in the waiting room. So they were called reactive, so that means contraction. So that basically you try to look for savings, reduce investments, and so on. So you can see that among the most important in general for the whole survey, the most important for Polish companies, based on this study, the most important proactive measures were the switch of the business models to more digitalization, not just communication with clients or with colleagues, so internal communication, but also digitalization of sales, digitalization of service delivery, the switch to more remote work, as well as investments in new technology were ranked relatively high among these proactive measures. New product applications, so basically trying to look for opportunities that the crisis brings and offer the products to new applications. To a bit lesser extent, bringing new products to the market during the crisis. And in this respect, there is a predominance of large companies among the proactive measures. So again, here the size matters in the way that the larger the companies, it seems that the more proactive measures they were taking. Now, switching to the reactive measures, you can see that among the reactive measures, so again, among the factors that were on average ranked as those where the companies made reductions, So you have the prices, so the pricing strategy. It is generally a level where the companies dropped the prices during the pandemic. The salaries, which were dropped on average as well. The level of fees, rentals, and so on was also marginally in the area of reduction. The production volume, employment level, average working time, employee mobility, obviously. And what is also surprising is the R&D intensity, the fact that it was not among the factors where the companies were on the increase, but it's something where they were curbing down during the crisis. And again, this is a factor where, but in the reactive companies, so for the reactive reactions, larger companies were, let's say, the most careful with making reductions. So while they did also reduce in these dimensions, they were the most, let's say, prudent ones in making too many cuts. So by foreign sales, the more internationalized the companies were, let's say the least proactive the reactions were. So this is basically interesting that internationalization did not actually favor more proactive behavior of the companies. Differently for the reactive, let's say, measures, where the more internationalized companies, so the gray ones, were the ones who were not so much willing to make cuts or reductions. Okay, so I'll just go to the industry sectors for a moment. So basically, the more high-tech sectors, so the green ones, the more high-tech sectors the companies were coming from, the more proactive the reactions were. So the more they were investing or launching new products or introducing new solutions, where in terms of reactive measures, also the high-tech companies from high-tech sectors were the ones that were recurring to the least extent to reactive measures, so trying to reduce volume, production volume, employment or salaries and so on. So just to summarize, because I didn't see any reminder from Erick, but I think I've exceeded. So apologies for that. So just briefly, the degree of effectiveness by the crisis does depend on firm size, but also by the internationalization exposure of the companies, as well as of the sectors, by knowledge intensity, by technological intensity, and so are responses to crisis. So it depends on where you work, how international you are, which size category you belong to, and that also differentiates among proactive and reactive responses to the crisis. And also the companies that were refraining from reactive reactions were the ones who were also the most optimistic about expanding in 2021 further in terms of internationalization, new product developments, and so on. So that has some implications for policy. I hope we'll be able to address them in the later discussion part. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Piotr, for this very valuable presentation, and also congratulations on the study. I think it's very clear the situation that companies are facing, even if they're big or they're small. So also one comment that I think is important before we pass on to our second panelist is that you mentioned something that was very important, and I think we can delve a little bit into that in the question round after the second presentation. You talked about the qualitative side, the qualitative dimension, not only understanding the scale of the problem, but also the details. And this is something that we work actually in here in Berlin as well, understanding the stories behind what companies are going through. So there's the data on the one side, and then also how they are reacting and telling their story and what they're looking into the future and how they're perceiving the future, because economics is about expectations, at least partly. Thank you very much for this. I think it was very valuable. We're going to, I would say we leave the questions for the end, yeah, so we can create the discussion after David's presentation. So this brings us to the second panelist of the day and of the evening, depending on where you see it, from which time zone. And I would like to introduce Professor David Bonilla Vargas from the UNAM. So I will tell you a little bit about David right now, and then I guess that you can already begin preparing maybe with the screen. So David Bonilla Vargas is a transport economist and a research professor at the Instituto de Investigaciones Económicas of the UNAM, which is Universidad Nacional Autónoma de México. He is attached to the Urban and Regional Economy Research Group at the same institute. David has held academic posts at Oxford and Cambridge universities, and he is a graduate from Tokyo University of Agriculture and Technology, and also from London University. Before that, he was an energy economist at the Institute of Energy Economics in Tokyo. And David has published widely in the Journal of Transport Policy, Transport Economics and Policy, Energy Policy, Supply Chain Management, and so on. His recent books include Air Power and Freight, The View from the European Union and China, from Springer. Then also the Handbook of Transport and Development, with also Professor Givoni and Bannister. He was a reviewer of the latest report on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and he leads the group on energy and natural resources and sustainable development at the postgraduate program of economics at UNAM. He is also a tutor of the sustainability science program at UNAM. And precisely that's what we're going to talk about today with David, sustainability. And of course, this brings us over to Latin America. So, David, I would give the floor now to you.
Yeah, thank you very much to everyone for giving me the opportunity to deliver this talk. I would like to thank, of course, my institute for organizing the event, Professor Isalia Nava and Professor Armando Sanchez as well, our director. And secondly, I'd like to thank also the ambassador of Poland and also Professor Behar for organizing the event, and of course to Poznań. So thank you very much to everyone for giving us this opportunity. And I'm going to share the screen now. So can you see it?
Yeah, we can see it.
Yeah. Okay, so this is the title of the presentation. It's the impact of COVID on lockdown, on mobility of the city, on energy and economic recovery. This is the agenda, this is the plan. We're going to talk about prices and their effects on the Mexican economy. And then we'll quickly talk about the implications on fiscal dependence of oil exports of the Mexican treasury. And following that, we'll connect the dots to the issues of mobility and the health of the economy. And finally, we'll talk about the infrastructure plans of the current administration, and we'll try to put it all together in the discussions. Questions about this talk: how is the lockdown affecting the demand, supply, and trade of petroleum products, the power, mobility of people, and freight in Mexico? The second question is, what are the effects of the lockdown on sustainable transport? And the third one is, it's quite an interesting question, which is, will transport infrastructure investment effects be positive on the wider economy? Are they enough or are they insufficient? So we're going to start with this very important diagram that I put together since January when we started to look at this problem. And basically, what I've noticed is that the oil price didn't react to the lockdowns of China immediately. And it was only until the war on the 31st of January that we can see some sort of decline. As you can see here from the graph, you can see a decline in the price of oil. So it took a while for oil traders and the world oil market to react to this, to the lockdown, to the appearance of the virus. As you know, the Americans were told about the virus in late December, according to the New York Times, but they only reacted in February. They only started their respective lockdowns in March, which is combining with the Mexico's announcement of the lockdown. So Mexico starts its lockdown in March. And before that, we could see some sort of decline in the price of oil. And finally, Mexico didn't participate oil supply agreement, which this was very controversial for Mexico because OPEC wanted Mexico to participate, but Mexico didn't want to because we were going to lose a lot of export revenue. So, and finally, well, the price has now recovered, which this graph is not showing you, but the price is now around $20 below the pre-pandemia level or the pre-Hubei and Wuhan lockdowns events. So this is very important for Mexico because we were earning about $30 billion of oil revenue before the pandemic, just to give you an idea. And the revenues collapsed almost 80% by April. So this had a huge of Mexico. And as you can see, well, this table gives you an idea of the fiscal dependency. And you can see that Mexico in 2018 had a 20% dependency on oil revenues, which is extremely high. And by 2020, according to the current president, he mentioned the other day that we now have a 10% dependency of oil revenues for the public budget. So, but you can see that Mexico is along with Bolivia, is one of the countries, and of course Venezuela, is one of the countries with a relatively high fiscal dependency on oil revenues. So just to repeat, oil prices are key for fiscal balance in Mexico, and of course for the losses that we had from the low oil prices, which affected oil revenues. We had a decline in fuel sales by our national oil company, which also provides billions of dollars of revenue for our treasury. So we had two shocks to the economy, not just the decline in oil revenues, but in fuel sales. And of course, if you have the decline in fuel sales, it means you have lower tax revenues. So these are just to give you an idea from 2019 to 2020. You have losses of fuel sales, and of course, as we were saying, tax revenue. This table gives you a breakdown of the fuel types which were affected. So for example, we're seeing diesel, which is very important for freight transport and for manufacturing. We see a decline of 32% to 2020. You see huge decline in kerosene, which is mainly jet fuel or air transport, which is about 58% decline. And that, of course, is correlated to tourism, to the decline in tourism in Mexico, which is also a big earner in Mexico. You're talking about $30 billion of revenue from tourism, which is correlated to the decline in jet fuel demand. So we're talking about billions of dollars in losses for the Mexican economy. You're talking about 20%, 28% decline in gasoline consumption as well, which is also obviously connected to driving, okay? And so on. So you see all these declines everywhere, which are quite serious for fuel tax levels. Coming to the transport sector, we can say that the transport sector can offer solutions to fight the pandemic, okay? But at the same time, this is the problem of transport. It's also a channel for the spread of the virus. There are 7 measures with which you can play in terms of effects in industry and so on. So, for example, aircraft and auto manufacturers such as Ford and Boeing changed their operations to manufacture medical equipment such as respirators and ventilators. And I mention this because Mexico is heavily connected to US supply chains. So obviously there are some benefits there where Mexican manufacturers can contribute towards this type of supply chains. Another way in which transport can contribute to fight the pandemic, for example, buses and taxis could offer reduced price or reduced transport fares to doctors and to transport food to hospitals. There are mobility apps, mobility-based applications which offer transport services. Another measure is the ride-share operators of Uber, Didi, and so on, which provide data to governments and also help to transmit government messages. There are also special service operators like taxis, trains, and buses, which are dedicated to passengers arriving from abroad. And finally, we also have drones, which can help to distribute products across the country. We know that there are drones that can distribute medicines. You can disinfect streets. You can make announcements to the public through loudspeakers. And drones are already used in Mexico. Of course, we're not as active as Shanghai and Beijing in China. They use the drones much more effectively than we do. So this to fight the pandemic. And finally, you have air cargo. You have aircraft which can distribute strategic supplies for vaccines, medical tests, masks, and essential medical equipment. However, we don't have enough fleet of aircraft to distribute at the right time, in the right volumes, all of the medicines that we need across the globe. And that's a serious strategic disadvantage for distributing further research to look at cargo capacity, which could meet the demand for distribution of the vaccines. So this is going to be the Achilles heel of the vaccine distribution, unfortunately. So you have to plan your strategic supplies according to your air cargo, but we don't have enough cargo facilities in Mexico. We don't have enough medicine, and we don't have the to achieve that. So moving to mobility impacts, I just wanted to look at the way the transport sector is being impacted because of the partial lockdown in Mexico. And what I found was mobility wasn't affected as much in Mexico as it was in Spain, for example, or in Korea. We're looking at Korean numbers where public transport was not reduced, was not impacted as badly as in Mexico. they were able to protect the transport sector, and people were able to use public transportation much more successfully. And you can see that initially, the initial lockdown was very significant in Mexico, but it's even now, if you look at this part, the latest part of the graph, the lockdown is not as bad as it was initially. So the internet is basically the driving mode or private transportation is the one that has recovered the most during the two lockdowns. And the walking rates have fallen again, which is quite bad for the health of the population, because we need to walk more on an everyday basis. And so but what we can see is that public transport was heavily impacted because of the failure of having a more strict, a more effective. And if you look at the US numbers, they're very similar to Mexico, because a lot of the transport depends on private transportation in the US. So we're not that different in that case. But then, yes, if you look at Mexico City, you will find that public transport hasn't recovered its rates of growth. And so obviously this is a barometer of the state of the economy, because if you have a shock in transportation, you will have a shock in the service economy, okay? So so transport is part of the supply chain, and it will reflect those effects. So just to give you a summary, has a greater negative effect on mobility. The second lockdown seems to reduce mobility less, and the service sector was greatly affected in Mexico, whereas the non-service sector, which we can see is related to driving, to car driving, was relatively less affected. So we can see that there is a silver lining when the global economy. What do we mean by silver lining? Well, there are benefits. One of the benefits is that air quality improved significantly in Mexico City. Gasoline and diesel consumption also fell strongly, which reduces carbon emissions and other levels of pollution. Accident rates also fell considerably, and noise reduction. So that's the silver lining of the current lockdown. So we've already said that car driving is recovering very fast, much faster than public transport. The new car market is suffering quite a lot, whereas the second-hand car market is doing relatively okay. Public transport is affected more than car driving, which is not very good for sustainable transport. And remember, the majority of employees in Mexico travel by public transport. 40% of the population will travel by public transport. So if you have low rates of public transport, that's just a reflection that economic activity is declining, okay? So that's a very good indicator. And we can track that. We can track those rates on an everyday basis. Walking rates are negative, which is not very good for the health of the population. And obviously we need to be walking every day for our mental health and our body health. So we've said that before, public transport has not recovered in Mexico City as we would have expected. Improving public health means supporting the economy. In other words, like Paul Krugman has said, in the New York Times, protecting health means protecting the economy, and that's what we need to do in Mexico. Having said that, the impact of the lockdown initially, which was in March 2020, did not affect the economy as much as it did in the lockdown, which I think probably was the right approach at the same time for Mexico, because we cannot afford to have a total lockdown like they did in France or Spain or Italy. We cannot afford to do that, because we have more than 60% of the population who have very low household incomes, so they need to survive somehow. As you know, the fiscal stimulus in Mexico has been extremely low. We're talking about not in comparison to Spain, which is a similar economy of 14%, Turkey 14%, Brazil 16%, Chile 8%, and so on. So obviously Mexico has provided a very low, very weak fiscal stimulus. Nevertheless, even before the pandemic, the government had published several estimates of the impact of the potential of, and you can see in the list here, the impacts on employment. And obviously, there will be some forward linkage effects. There will be impacts on other industries from all the different projects. And the most controversial project was the refinery of Dos Bocas, which was supposed to provide about 72,000 jobs. We're still waiting to see if those jobs will materialize. We're talking about power generation. We're talking about urban regeneration with 228,000 jobs. And then we talk about the ports, which will be connected to the railways with 7,000 jobs, and the Maya train, which is supposed to deliver about 80,000 jobs in the next 7 years. So we think a lot of these initiatives are positive, and according to some estimates, this is equivalent to 500,000 that will be generated. Obviously, there is uncertainty on the dates of completion of these projects. So there will be some uncertainty, especially in completing the new refinery in Mexico. But all of the other projects have a relatively low uncertainty, which means they may be able to deliver these levels of jobs in the whole context of the Maya train. It has a lot of problems, I don't deny it. But one of the good things about the Maya train, which will be deployed in one of the touristic regions of Mexico, one of the most dynamic regions of Mexico. One of the good things is that it will somehow reduce or help to mitigate poverty. You have to remember, a lot of these projects are based in very poor regions of Mexico. So I think that's a positive for Mexico's regional development. However, it's not sufficient. We need more infrastructure programs in Mexico. If you compare the numbers to Brazil, obviously Brazil has much higher infrastructure programs, much bigger infrastructure investments than Mexico does. So in conclusion, the lockdown reduces the demand, supply, and trade for petroleum products, which reduces oil revenues and tax revenues from transport fuels. So that's been an issue for Mexico. And as you know, the COVID-19, the virus has affected in the past few months the level of oil prices, and it's a key macroeconomic variable for Mexico. The virus doesn't encourage sustainable transport, as we saw from the evidence of our data, private transportation has recovered, which somehow increases gasoline and diesel consumption. And transport infrastructure investments, as we have discussed from the previous table, the effects can be positive, but they're too slow and insufficient for the wider economy. So my presentation.
All right, thank you very much, David. That's a very, very interesting point that you raised in the very end, because precisely one of the things that we have believed after looking at different press reports and also in different discussions is that there has been some type of environmental recovery leading to potential conclusions that actually the virus has led to sustainability, which, as you're showing us, does not necessarily correspond to a sustainable solution. So this is going to sound a little bit strange, but maybe this sustainable effect is not sustainable at all with the data that you're showing us, which is a very, very impressive result that I think is essential for policymakers, especially because we shouldn't only look at the short run, but also at the long run. So right now, just one organizatory matter. Remember that you can write your questions on YouTube. You can send us your questions that you have for one of the specific panelists or a general question. And a second organizatory matter, don't forget that on the 23rd of February, there's going to be the third event regarding the response to the COVID pandemic, hosted by the Embassy of Poland as well. So please save the date, the 23rd of February. Now, I'm going to turn now to a question that I would like to address first to Piotr. So you were talking about the perspective of companies, and there is one thing that we always maybe have in mind. We don't always ask, but I would like to ask for your impression concerning the subject of trust and optimism on the side of these Polish companies that are very active internationally, as you showed us from your sample. But what is their perspective in general regarding these proactive, reactive responses in terms of trust? What have you been able to gather from their opinions, and how are they feeling right now? Of course, we have uncertainty everywhere. I mean, it's impossible to say that we have certainty in anything right now. But how do you perceive this look into the future from the side of exporters?
Okay, so trust is not specifically, explicitly an aspect that I was exploring in this exporter project. But answering your question, I would like to share an insight from another project that I'm involved in, which is related to the food sector. So both local food producers and restaurant businesses, which have been, as we know, particularly critically hit by the crisis. And this project is about developing cooperation in times of the pandemic between local producers and producers of food, regional food, and restaurant businesses. And the observation that I could make in these months since March till now is that, unfortunately, and this is shared by other insights, is that the level of social capital, speaking of Poland, I'm curious about Mexico, maybe you can comment, but the level of social capital, unfortunately, is not as we would like it to be. So the level of trust in business, especially if we look at specific sectors, and I'm just basing my answer on this one food business and restaurant business.
Essential sector.
Yeah, exactly, and the level of trust is low, and this is supported by other studies that there have been attempts by some colleagues like Jan Fazlagic, a colleague from our university as well, to quantify the effect of, let's say, how much the economy loses because of lack of trust, and this goes in billions of euros or dollars annually. So this is a massive, let's say, impact. And based on the restaurant business, there could be much more, let's say, to gain and during this crisis if the companies were cooperating, like joining cooperatives, producing or creating joint offers to consumers. But they're actually keeping their opportunities, their routines, and they are not so open to new ideas. And this is one of the, let's say, painful learnings that I have made. Although on the other hand, this is also a sector which has seen some innovations and some transformations of the business models. So one of the factors that make companies, well, survive better this crisis, for example, restaurants have transformed increasingly into producers. So if your restaurant business is closed and you're not able to deliver food to everyone, it just accounts maybe for 20% of the usual revenue. So it doesn't save you and all the jobs. So where to look for the new business? So many of them just turned towards production. So selling through the consumer channels their own products. So from restaurants, they became producers of different ready meals and so on. Rather than offering restaurant services, so a kind of transformation of the business model. But again, this was done more in isolation by the single businesses, not in cooperation and so on. So the trust factor is definitely missing. So yeah. So to answer your point, unfortunately, that's a problem.
Yes. Okay. So that's a very, very interesting insight. And actually, it's also like a paradox. On the one side, you have innovation that is possible through this change in the business model, but at the same time, innovation that requires also cooperation, one way or the other, is not really operating. And it's interesting because we were talking precisely today in our class in behavioral economics here in Berlin about cooperation and the prisoner's dilemma and all of these matters, precisely in the middle of a pandemic. All right, I have a question now for David. Thank you very much, Piotr, for your very valuable insights. So I have a question regarding transport infrastructure. So do you think that the transport infrastructure investments are achieving, or they're going to achieve the desired objective on the wider economy for Latin America, specifically for the case of Mexico, and also with your global view on the world economy? How do you perceive that, David?
I think yes, there are primary effects, there are secondary effects of transport infrastructure investment. There are long-term impacts, there are short-term impacts, there are the big hits impact. So I think Mexico should be looking for the big impacts which have a short-term effect, like building roads, for example. That could produce lots of employment very, very quickly, as you learn from the British economy during the war. That's what they did, to come out of the war. Keynes was suggesting that type of measure, although in the context of green economic growth, of climate change, what you need is more railways in the country. So I think that's the correct step. Having said that, you need to make sure that the supply chain doesn't suck in imports to set up your train infrastructure. Otherwise, you're going to have to be importing components from Germany, from the US, and you're not really building up your own domestic capacity, which is what China is doing. You see, the Chinese were very clever because they build
for decades.
It took decades to build their manufacturing industry, but the difference being is that they build their high-speed railways with their own technology, and they didn't depend on foreign technology as much as we do, for example. But I still welcome, even if we use important components, I still welcome building the railways, because your energy balance is very negative at the moment. You're importing more than $20 billion per year of foreign energy. You're importing, I don't know, $6 billion of gas, $14 billion of diesel and gasoline, and that's not sustainable. That's not sustainable. And it's all coming from Texas, which is great for them, but it's not so great for us. We need to be thinking of developing our own railway industry, just like Japan did. So I welcome it, but I know it's not enough. I'm aware that we basically need more in all around Mexico City. We need railways, and we're desperate for that. We need to learn from Europe. We need to learn from Poland, from Germany, who have developed very dense tree. And that's the future. You know, everyone's doing it. France is doing it. Spain is doing it. Of course, Spain benefited from entering the euro. They have very low borrowing rates, and they have lots of money from regional development funds, which we don't
current
have.
Money supply.
And there's NAFTA. Exactly. Yeah. So they entered a credit market, which was with very good loan terms, and we don't have that here. So we have the TMEC, but the TMEC doesn't offer you cheap infrastructure projects. It doesn't have that. It doesn't have labor movement, for example. It has some sort of labor movement. You can move to the US, for example, or Americans can move to Mexico. We have the executive business type visas.
Much more complicated. Yeah.
You know, you can do integration that you have in Europe. You're much more integrated. So yeah, I think transport does have a lot of solutions, you know, but they need to be done now. Otherwise, we'll keep building and depending on obsolete technology like gasoline technology. You know, we need to be moving forward with electric vehicle deployment, electric railways, which are very sustainable. So I'd rather see railways than trucks in my region, in that beautiful part of Mexico, in the Caribbean. Of course, ideally, I would like to see nothing, ideally, but we can't do that, right? We need to provide.
Oh, that's a bit harder, yeah.
People. And yes, it's hard. It's hard for the local population. And to be honest, there's always losers in any transport infrastructure projects. There will be losers. Yes, I agree with that. But in terms of reducing the gasoline and the diesel imports, it will help a lot. Yes, dramatically.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much, David, for that insight. And that, actually, when you were mentioning the railways now, I was thinking about the financial history of the UK with the railway mania in the 1840s, when there was an excessive development of railways precisely because of financial speculation that led to the 1847 crisis, which is like an irony, because on the one side, you have a country that desperately needs the railways. And then when you look 150 years back, or even more, 170 years back, you have an excessive development precisely because of speculation and capital. So this is also an interesting thing to look at. So now that we have already reached, 8 p.m. here in Europe, and that time is, of course, very scarce, as always in economics, I'm going to pose a final question, and I would appreciate if the panelists can be very, very concise regarding this question. So there's a question from Jose Manuel Estrada for Piotr, and I'm going to read it, and then I have a final question for David, and then we would close. So the question for Piotr is, which industrial sectors do you believe that are going to improve their capacity in post-pandemic times in Poland?
Okay, it's my question. What do we understand by capacity? If we talk about the output, or if we talk about, let's say, the qualitative side.
Capacity and size. Capacity and size says the question here.
Well, so definitely you can see probably like in some other regions or countries, you can see the surge of different services that have gone online, and you know, as I've shown in the presentation, some sectors that have been particularly badly hit, like entertainment, recreation, they had to resort to either, you know, you close. For instance, if you're organizing events, concerts, then of course it's a drama. But some companies, like managing events, organizing events, they have decided from day one to day two, let's change our business model dramatically. And for example, let's focus on online coaching, remote work solutions, or an interesting example, inspiring example is services for people who work from home and have children because that's another drama that has been, this situation of children in schools, and especially at the age of having to learn effectively and finding themselves in a situation. But what about the parents working from home? How do they manage their lives? And there have been examples of companies offering services specifically to this new, let's say, new target group. So generally, I would say, in general, I know it's a broad answer, but probably stimulates some further debate, maybe another time, is that regardless of whether it's low, high, or mid-tech, all types of companies which are able to, let's say, transform the business models, so innovate not necessarily in terms of technology, but in terms of the way of thinking and let's say, adjusting to the new situation and squeezing as much as possible of the current, let's say, changed situation and situation of uncertainty, well, they will be the winners and the ones who will be, let's say, on the increase. Otherwise, I would say the answer will not be surprising that well, I've seen also from working with companies and talking with companies that, for instance, the food business, the food retail, so not talking about restaurants, right? But retail has been doing particularly well. We remember the jokes from the beginning of the lockdown with toilet paper, right, and the different products that people were stocking them. But generally, retail companies, especially those that were able to, let's say, merge or use concurrently the online channel and classical channels, they have done particularly well in the last time. So yeah.
All right, thank you very much, Piotr, for this. Now, the final question for David, and we would close with this. Unfortunately, we don't have more time for other questions, but it would be a very fine discussion. If you had to recommend, David, to Latin American policymakers, let's say, decisions that they could make and improvements that they can undertake with the current situation, from your expertise in energy and in sustainable transportation, beyond the railways, what would your recommendations be in a nutshell? So Latin America in general.
I think what connect finance to sustainable transport, for example, you could create bigger markets for green finance. You could enter the emissions trading program, like the European Union emissions trading. You can buy and sell pollution. You can create bond programs as well. You can give more financial independence to the Mexico City government, so the Mexico City government can raise revenue for sustainable transport. So there are some short term you can implement, like a type of carbon tax, but you need to design it very carefully, because the carbon tax will impact on the low income population. So you can introduce congestion charges like they've done in London, and then recycle the revenue back into infrastructure
and invest it productively.
Yeah, so long as you recycle your tax revenue, you'll be fine. But a lot of governments are afraid of taxes because they don't take into account the possibilities for recycling the revenues. And you can create jobs as well if you recycle those revenues for education and public transport. And the second thing would be to create stronger local institutions, which is not impossible to do in Mexico City. So I think they're, connecting the dots. It's develop green finance tools, initiatives. Development Bank has been trying to do, which I think they do have some good ideas on green finance, but we need to engage more with the local government and allow them more financial independence.
More financial independence and flexibility.
Yes.
Okay, that's great. Actually, that connects with precisely my favorite subject that has to do with efficiency in public spending, but not necessarily just minimizing costs, but actually looking for the qualitative dimension of the exact things that are being done instead of hiring too many people and having this legalism does not allow you to invest in productive things because the public officials are scared of the consequences, the personal consequences when they try to be innovative in this idea of the entrepreneurial state. So this brings us also to another conclusion for everybody before I thank you all for participating, and that's that we have further debates coming and that this discussion is not over. And of course, as you see, there's a lot of subjects that we have to keep discussing from academia and from policymaking in general to try to connect those dots that David and that Piotr were talking about. So I would like to thank all of you, to thank very, very specially the Polish Embassy in Mexico, of course, our colleagues at UNAM, and our colleagues also at Poznań University of Economics and Business. It has been a pleasure to discuss with you, and I am, of course, very pleased. I hope to see you very soon in the future. And I hope that everybody stays safe and that we can talk again in person one day. All right, thank you very much to everyone, and have a great afternoon or a great evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Maybe if there's any announcement on the side of the embassy or UNAM that you would like to make. I had said at the beginning, the next event is going to be on the 23rd of February. So save the date. And thanks very much to everyone. We'll be in touch.
Yeah. Thank you. Goodbye.
Goodbye, everybody. Thank you.